super excited today that we have Eddie Sorrells, who I've known a really long time. I think almost for my full 23 years, one of my mentors, and certainly has enough letters after his name, which he'll go into with you later today, this afternoon. But Eddie's a very experienced operator and lawyer and participant to the executive level with a wonderful company in Dothan, Alabama called DSI. And anybody that spends a minute or two on LinkedIn will recognize why he's here with us today. And he's got some specific goals and part of his presentation today, which I'm really excited about, because we talk a lot about what the security officer looks like, what are the challenges around managing that workforce, what are some of the legalities and regulatory overhang in managing them. And then lastly, I think, and most importantly, setting the pick for continuous education around the technology pivot in man guarding. So with that, I'll introduce Eddie and remind everyone we've got a list of questions already going. So we'll save questions for the end, but I'm excited and I'm sure you will be too. So sit in and buckle up and we'll have a great session. Thank you. Eddie, let's do it.
Well, Jeff, first of all, I want to thank you for this invitation and thank you to Thinkcurity. As you've already mentioned, the staff has been wonderful and been looking forward to this for quite some time. So to all the attendees that have joined us here this afternoon, as Jeff laid out, we look forward to an engaging, impactful discussion. When I talk about the topic of the evolution of the security officer, there are so many different directions that we could go in. So one of the great things that I'm looking forward to is a very engaging Q&A later with Jeff. And as Jeff and I were preparing for this session, we not only talked about some of the topics we wanted to cover in this conversation, but also some additional topics as we got to the Q&A portion. So let's just jump into this. When we talk about the evolution of the security officer profession, we're going to go down a couple of different paths to this afternoon. First of all, where we've been, where we are now, and where we're going to be going in the future. But before I dig into that, let me sort of set the context as far as my perspective. So let's look at where I'm coming from and just ask the question, quite frankly, what do I know about this topic? So if we go to the next slide here, we'll see that you may be asking yourself, what experience do you bring to this? One of the things that you'll notice is on the left, you see a very terrified, nervous young security officer, not real sure what he's gotten himself into. And on the right, you'll also see a very nervous, terrified mid-level manager who has been worn down a little bit by the industry, but still not quite sure what he had gotten himself into. But let's talk about what I know when it comes to the private security industry. In 1991, I was a college student and I was looking to eventually go to law school. My dad was a prosecutor and that was my ultimate destiny, I thought at that time. And so I was hooked up with a company that had been part of my family friendship for many years, just to have something to do on the side as I continued my educational career. That was 32 years ago, actually next month. Now, as I sit here today, I can honestly tell you, I had no ambition, no plan, no real desire to stay in the private security industry when I started. And I get asked quite often, why did you stay? And it sounds very cliche, but the honest answer is I fell in love with the private security industry. I liked what I did. I saw a future in that career, and so I stuck around. And I was fortunate enough to have a company that invested in me when it came to educational opportunities, learning new skills, and really going up the ladder and seeing things from all angles. So here I sit 32 years later. And I talk to a lot of security company colleagues, and we talk about how the industry has changed in the last 30 plus years, and we're certainly going to get into that later. But one of the things that I tell groups when I speak to them is most of what I learned about the private security industry, I actually learned on that post at 2 o'clock in the morning, talking to people that may have been 2 or 3 times my age. I learned how to work with a very diverse group of people from different backgrounds. I learned how to deal with issues, how to de-escalate situations, how to protect premises, assets, property, people. And so I would ask you this question as we move along this webinar today. If you haven't been back to the post lately, do you need to go back to that post and relearn some of those lessons? Now, I still get out to the post occasionally, and I'm sure a lot of our attendees do as well. But are we taking the time to recognize that there are new challenges that are present today that weren't there 5, 10, certainly 30 years ago when I was a security officer trying to make a living? And what has changed for that security officer? Now, one of the things you're going to hear me say throughout this presentation is that we have to do a better job of telling our story as a security industry. When I was in law school, and by the way, Jeff mentioned that I am an attorney, and that's not my purpose of speaking here today. And quite often when I'm introduced, I ask people, say, don't mention the attorney part, because people are going to assume that I'm going to talk twice as long and tell you half as much. So I'm not going to do that today. We're going to talk about the private security industry. But when I was in law school, I was in a moot court competition, and a law professor took me aside right before I was going to make my closing argument. And he told me, Eddie, remember, the law is not as important as the story you're about to tell. As an industry, we've got to do a better job of telling our story. And we're going to talk about that throughout this afternoon. So next, let's talk about really the path we're going to go down this afternoon, where we've been, where we are now, and where we're going to go. And by the way, some of these are just my personal opinions. I look forward to hearing in the QA some of the opinions that you have. But next, let's look at some of the historical context. And we could spend a lot of time on the history of the security officer, but one of the first areas we're going to see here in the next slide is where we actually came from, how private security got its start. And if we'll go to that next slide, we're going to see that there's been a lot of debate as to where private security came from. And I'm going to give you a couple of little contextual points here. But the villages urban were actually guarded the city of Rome. So we were around certainly almost since the beginning of time. And my next example, we'll talk about that we probably were one of the oldest professions in the world. But back then they were called watchmen. The root word of that is being vigilant. They were the firemen, they were the security force, they were the police force, making sure that things were in right order. Theft was not occurring, violence was not occurring. So this goes back to the old days in the Middle Ages of Europe. Now on this next slide, if you want to put things in a religious context, and I stole this from one of my colleagues through ASIS many years ago, he was giving a presentation and his slide asked the question, what is the oldest profession in the world? Now, we want to make sure we keep this webinar family friendly, so don't insert your answers to that question in the chat, because most of us have a canned response when we hear what is the oldest profession in the world. But if you want to put a religious context to it, going back to Genesis, we actually see that one of the first security officers, in fact, some translations of the Bible use the word sentry to really describe that someone was guarding the tree of life there in the Garden of Eden. So next time you want to put things in context, tell someone, hey, what's the oldest profession in the world? They'll give you the standard answer. Your response can be, hey, you're wrong. It was actually a security officer. So let's look at the next slide and really talk about some of the historical footprints that we have when it comes to the history of the security officer. Now, you'll see a lot here. I'm using the word guard. There has been a lot of debate over the last several years about guard versus officer. I personally use the phrase security officer. But in historical context, we started with watchman, then it developed into security guard, et cetera. So the word guard is used here in a lot of historical context. But security guards have been around for centuries. We just saw that, dating back to ancient times where guards were employed to really protect assets and protect members of the royal family. Back in the Middle Ages, wealthy merchants. Even back then, people were employing private security to stop theft, to protect their belongings. In the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution really brought about an increased need for security because factories were booming, businesses were taking off. Who was going to guard the property? Who was going to guard the employees? Who was going to make sure theft didn't occur? So we even see then that a rise in private security was taking place. During the Second World War, security officers were already guarding government buildings, military bases, et cetera. And we've seen that continue certainly in modern day. So let's look next at really, one of the things that we can't talk about private security history without at least giving a nod to Alan Pinkerton. And by the way, we could do an entire webinar on Alan Pinkerton, a very fascinating figure. If you're a student of history and want to learn more about private security history, I would recommend many, many books about Alan Pinkerton. He's a very, very unique figure. For example, he was born in Scotland, immigrated to the U.S., wound up in Chicago, became a police officer, and actually started the Pinkerton Agency because he was interested in doing that private detective work. And really what we now know as the modern security agency started back with Alan Pinkerton. Of course, he had involvement in presidential protection. He was famous for getting involved in labor disputes, et cetera. But his legacy still lives on today when we see what is happening in the private protection industry. And one of the things that really popped up during the time of Pinkerton is this philosophy and this idea of detect, deter, observe, and report. Really the hallmark of what private security does day in and day out, making sure that someone is being vigilant and protecting property and assets and reporting any threats to the same. So Alan Pinkerton, a very colorful, very unique figure, and by the way, the Pinkertons are still around today, so you can see the staying power of what he created. So next, let's look at something else in the context of how important private security officers have really been throughout history. I've always been looking for examples to really prove how valuable what we do really is. We're going to talk later about return on investment for end users and how valuable security officers are to critical infrastructure, et cetera. But we all know in this industry, sometimes that can be very difficult to quantify. And even more so, it can be difficult to really convey that to the private security officer themselves. What you do is vitally important. What you do is critical to this facility. I use this example for many, many years, probably dating back 20 years when I used to train security officers on report writing. And since that time, the media has picked up on this story. And so it's not quite as unknown as it used to be. But let me just use an example to prove the point of how critical security officers have been throughout history. We all know this gentleman here on this slide, arguably the most disgraced president of modern times, if not the history of the U.S. We know that he was asked or forced to resign in disgrace over the Watergate scandal. But imagine just for a second that things were different. If you were to open your computer this afternoon and you were to Google Richard Nixon, imagine if this is what popped up on Wikipedia. President Richard Nixon was reelected to a second term in November 1972 in a landslide. After a successful second term, he retired as a revered and honored national figure. He went on to become one of our nation's most respected former presidents as he traveled the globe wielding influence on foreign matters and collecting awards and honors for his charitable work. His name now adorns many D.C. office buildings as well as hospitals, schools, and churches. Now, that's not the Nixon that we know, and that's not the legacy he left. And if we go to the next slide, I would argue this is the man that's responsible for that. I call this the most famous daily activity report in history. Frank Wills was a security officer at the Watergate on June 17th, 1972. Security Officer Wills was observing and reporting what he saw. He noticed that some paper had been stuffed into doors. Back then, it was a little bit easier to burglarize offices. You just had to stuff paper in doors and you could gain entry. But he observed these things. He saw some suspicious activity. He knew things were not what they should be. And so he documented this in his DAR, but he also went on to report this. And we now know that the burglars were caught, and that caused the downfall of a presidency. So I use this as an example to tell security officers, and quite frankly, people like me, how important what we do potentially could be. I would use this DAR to train security officers to say, you never know when you're writing your report how important and how valuable that report may be. Of course, this report is part of the National Archives and part of our national history forever, all because a private security officer was doing what he was trained to do. So next, let's move on and talk about how we view security officers currently. I mentioned at the outset that we've got to do a better job of telling our story. We come in contact with men and women every day that are doing outstanding work, astonishing things in the line of duty. But let's talk about Frank Wills and how far we've really come. Frank Wills was actually given an increase from $80 a week to $82.50 as a reward for catching the Watergate burglars. Now, without going into adjusting for inflation and what that looks like in today's dollars, probably not a great reward. And if you dig into the history of Frank Wills, his life sort of took a nosedive after that for a lot of reasons. But think about this. How many Frank Wills have there been in the last 50 years that have gone unrecognized? How many great acts of courage, heroism, just simple doing your duty and uncovering a theft or a major incident have gone unnoticed? So we've got to do a better job of telling that story. And ask yourself this question as you listen this afternoon. What is the public perception of security officers in 2023? And how can we improve that? Right now, and I tell people all the time that security officers are engaged in protecting critical infrastructure, federal, state buildings, and we saw a lot of selfless sacrificing during COVID. We've talked about that in other webinars that I've been involved in about how private security stepped up to do jobs that no one else would do during COVID. So we've got to continue that momentum to shine the light on how important their work really is. So let's look next at what is happening when it comes to the security officer force. We're going to talk in a few minutes about how technology is changing the private security industry. But one of the things that really goes unnoticed is that private security in most countries are going to outnumber law enforcement. Now, we owe a great debt to law enforcement. We've got to do a much better job to show them the respect that they deserve, give them the funding that they deserve, and by the way, work hand in hand with law enforcement. But oftentimes when I'm talking to someone, usually, by the way, it's an attorney that I'm working with that doesn't have a real knowledge of private security. One example that I will use to really set the context is I will say, well, hey, you live in city X. And when you leave your house or your apartment and you walk down the street or you interact in certain buildings or with certain clients, odds are that you're coming in contact much more with private security than you are law enforcement. In any given day, you're going into buildings that are protected, that are kept safe and secure by private security, not always law enforcement. So my prediction is these numbers are going to continue to grow in size around the world as the demand for private security increases. So just one more factor to really drive home the point how valuable private security is in securing not just our nation, but our world. So next, let's look at, one of the things that's happening is the demand is increasing because we need private security now more than ever. You see what is happening in the news day in and day out, not just in big cities, but in small towns. We see that law enforcement funding is finite. And so private security is having to step up to fill that need in certain situations. One of the things that we're seeing throughout not just our country, but around the world is new threats emerging. I go back to the picture of the skinny, scared kid 32 years ago as a security officer. The threats that he faced were much, much different than the security officers are facing now in 2023. I remember my training consisted of, hey, if somebody doesn't leave when you ask them to, just call the police. Well, now that training is not going to be as effective. Back then, we talked about workplace violence. We talked about warning signs. The training that I got back then is vastly different than what we're doing now when it comes to active assailant response or how to recognize threats. A lot of new challenges that we're looking at. Security officers are being asked to do things they were never asked to do before. So we have to recognize that they matter now more than ever. So next, we're going to dive into looking at actually how the security industry is being transformed. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about at least one new challenge, and there are many new challenges that we could highlight, but at least one that we're looking at in the future. So the fourth industrial revolution, are we ready as an industry? Are we prepared for that technology advancement that's already happening at a very, very rapid pace? Because of the pandemic, we certainly have seen labor struggles, labor shortages throughout private security and the service sector in general. And that's given rise to a lot of conversations about robotics, automation, being more efficient. And I'll touch on that more in a minute, but it really, in my mind, is about being better in many respects. So ask yourself the question, is your company, is our industry prepared for what that industrial revolution is already bringing about? It's happening. It's going to happen more rapidly in the future. So next, let me touch on this point. If we go to the next slide, you'll see here that I've got an illustration about how technology sometimes can advance very rapidly while not really advancing at all for many, many, many years before. I go back to that 32 years ago, the security officer on the post. We were using written timesheets. We were logging in our time. We put down when we came in, when we left. I would like to say that just a few years after that, we transitioned into biometric or electric timekeeping, but that didn't happen until just recently, the last 10, 15 years. In fact, many companies are still using written timesheets, and there are a lot of reasons that some companies may be using those. I talk to a lot of companies that still hang on to that for a lot of reasons. But my point here is that sometimes the industry can be very slow to adopt, all industries for that matter. So think about this. Since the beginning of time, some of the historical context that I mentioned before, we use the same mechanism for report writing and timekeeping for thousands of years. Was it a stone tablet? No. But the same principle applies when you're writing something down. And only recently did we sort of evolve into the electronic timekeeping, and I'll talk about electronic incident reporting here in a minute. So sometimes it can be very slow to adapt. So on this next slide, here's another example. Where was that security officer? Now, this is the portion of the webinar where I'm going to sort of divide you up into two groups. Some are going to recognize these devices, some aren't. 32 years ago, when I stepped foot on that private security post, I was handed one of these. Now, if you're under 40, you're probably wondering why I'm holding a canteen with a clock in the middle of it. If you're over 40 and you've been in private security for a while, you probably recognize one of these. But I was handed one of these, and I was told that placed very strategically throughout the site, I would find a series of keys attached to the wall. And as I made my rounds, I was asked to take one of these keys, insert it into this clock, and make a quick turn that would make an impression on a paper disc and would show the customer and my supervisor where I was and when I was there. That was the technology that I was using 32 years ago. So if we move to the next slide, we'll see now we have the benefit of leveraging technology for many, many different things when it comes to aggregating that important data. First of all, even though that DTEX clock was supposed to tell my superiors and my customer where I was, it really didn't. And if we had time, I could go into stories about how people really attempted to evade the clock and really find out workarounds to get around really doing what they were supposed to do. But now we have the benefit of geolocation, of knowing where the security officer is at all times, what he or she is doing. Instant reporting. Gone are the days where we have to wait for the security officer to fill out a report, put it under someone's door. They come in a couple of weeks later, review the report. They ask for it to be rewritten, et cetera. Now we have instant reporting, instant notifications. And why is that important? Just because technology is cool? Not just that, we now have a way to prove our return on investment by using that data. I was speaking to a group a couple of weeks ago, and this question came up about data management. One of the things the industry has to really get their arms around in the future is how do we manage data better? Because we have the data. We have the data points, but how do we use that when it comes to predictive analytics? How do we use that to inform future decisions? How do we use that to really make our security plan better? And remote management. I can remember being a young security officer and having to drive to the branch office to drop off my DAR or drop off my incident report. I remember having to drive sometimes a couple hours away to meet with security officers when I was in management to get that report and talk about what happened the night before. Now we have remote management capabilities, whether it's remote video monitoring or receiving IRs. So let's go on to the next slide and talk about that security officer of the future. And again, this is my opinion as to what skill set that security officer is going to need. And by the way, even though we're talking about the future, a lot of these have to be present right now. First of all, soft skills, and that's a very broad topic. But when I was a security officer many years ago, I didn't really have that skill set because I didn't think it was necessary or needed. Now we have to equip security officers with the ability to de-escalate situations, to remain calm under pressure, to deal with upset and angry members of the public, whether it's client employees or someone in a public setting. That's going to be crucial moving forward. From a legal standpoint, that's even doubly crucial when it comes to how we respond to certain situations. Along the same lines, legal skills. No security officers of the future are not going to have to be attorneys, thank goodness, but they have to possess some legal knowledge. First of all, use of force. That seems like an obvious one, but when to apply the level of force and what's really necessary and required. I could do an entire webinar on First Amendment auditors. If you haven't been hit with that yet, get ready, it's coming. Making sure the security officer knows what he or she can and can't do when it comes to public spaces. And the right to privacy, that's changing from state to state. So the officers have to have a good working knowledge of some of these legal skills. Technology. If you're entering into the private protection industry, you're going to have to know some level of technology, whether it's robotics, autonomous response, remote video monitoring, using artificial intelligence in some way. That's going to be a must moving forward. And something that I call fluid risk and positioning. Many people on this call have probably been around for many, many years, maybe longer than I have, and you're used to that RFP saying 2 officers around the clock for the next 10 years. And that's just the way it's going to be. One of my predictions in the future is that we're actually going to be seeing that we're going to evolve based on risk, based on the threat posture, based on things that are happening. It may be we have an officer here on the north side of the property, but we've got to divert them to the south based on some of the data that we're seeing when it comes to incidents. Or we're going to deploy a camera here temporarily. So having that fluid risk and positioning moving forward. And just a quick note, is observe and report still applicable? Now, let me say before I go any further, it's always going to be applicable in many, many situations. If I have any attorney friends on the call, they'll back me up in saying that is one of the things we cling to. We're not there to apprehend someone or to fight crime. We're there to observe and report. However, when it comes to some of the end users' expectations in very high-risk environments, private policing, for example, are we going to be asked to morph into observe and respond? Next slide, please. So as we look, when it comes to new challenges moving forward, and when I was thinking about this, there were so many different areas that I could go in. But this is one that I've been doing a lot of work in lately. And this revolves around the uptick and rise in permitless and open carry. Now, before I go any further, there's various opinions, I'm sure, on this call, certainly throughout the industry when it comes to the Second Amendment. That's not the purpose of raising this today. The purpose of raising this today is we're going to have to grapple in the future with this concept of good guys with guns versus bad guys with guns. Many of the states, primarily southern states, have passed laws where it's totally legal to open carry or to carry without any type of weapons permit. Now, how does this relate to private security? Do we have to adapt our policies, our training, our communication to meet this new challenge? Even before this, there was something known as parking lot or trunk laws, where employees were allowed to bring their weapons to work, subject to certain restrictions, being locked in the glove box, et cetera. And so that was a cause for concern. But how are security companies going to respond, not just to that, but now a permitless carry environment? If you're in the venue security business, if you're securing large premises for music festivals or sports stadiums, et cetera, pay attention to this example. I'm going to show you a very brief video clip that really illustrates this and what may be coming in the future.
A major disappointment for music lovers. Today, we learned officially organizers have canceled Music Midtown this year. In this tweet, they didn't give a specific reason, only saying due to unforeseen circumstances. But Channel 2's Dave Huddleston is live now in the newsroom, and you're hearing some event planners and fans too believe Georgia's gun laws, Dave, playing a pivotal role here.
We definitely are, George. We just got new information that may explain why this happened and so abruptly. It appears a local man is challenging public events that stop people from carrying weapons. Georgia law says people have the right to carry guns on public property in places like Piedmont Park and Music Midtown. Organizers of Atlanta's premier music festival, Music Midtown, canceled the event Monday. More than 40 musicians from Future to Fall Out Boy won't be performing September 17th and 18th. Channel 2 Action News got exclusive details from what may have caused the festival cancellation. From 2 independent sources, we got this email from a Monroe County man who told the Atlanta City Attorney May 4th, quote, "First of all, I do not agree that purchasing a ticket is a surrender of my Second and Fourth Amendment rights. The second problem is that lawfully carried weapons cannot be banned in public parks." Organizers sent out this notice that said, "Hey, Midtown fans, due to circumstances beyond our control, Music Midtown will no longer be taking place this year." Even though they didn't give a specific reason, some city and event planners say it's because the festival could not ban guns in Piedmont Park.
I do know a lot of the artists' riders do have that in their contract, that and at a public place like this, if you can't, they're not going to perform.
Under Georgia law, people have been allowed to carry at Music Midtown without being prohibited for probably 8 years at least.
So you see just one example, and admittedly that's anecdotal, but are we going to see more and more of that? Regardless of whether we're talking about a large music venue or a courthouse or a public park, or maybe even a private customer that you have that may be part of a public complex, having that training, that knowledge is going to be very, very important. So let's talk lastly about where we're going when it comes to technology in the future. I've been saying for many years, and by the way, I'm no prophet. Sometimes I just sort of stumble into these predictions, that we're going to see an increase when it comes to our customers asking for technology. For years, I would talk to colleagues in the industry about autonomous response, remote video monitoring, et cetera, when it was sort of in its infancy. And the response that I would get back is, well, Eddie, nobody's asking for that. Our customers are not asking us for technology, so we're just going to stick to the security officer lane. And often my response would be, well, you want to do that before they start asking for it, because at some point they will. I would propose to you that we are sort of at that breaking point now where customers are starting to ask for that. We see it much more in RFPs, proactively calling for technology. What technology do you have to enhance our program to make it better? And we have to ask ourselves the question, are our customers in some cases moving more quickly than we are? Now, one of the reasons I pose that question is we're seeing our customers adopt technology at a very rapid pace. So they're looking at us saying, well, we're doing it. Why aren't you doing it? It's making us more efficient. It's making us better. Why can't it not make you more efficient and make you more adequate when it comes to security plans and processes? And here's the question, a very simplistic question that I ask myself when it comes to technology. I'm sure there's a lot of great technology experts on this webinar. I don't consider myself one of those, by the way, but I ask a very simple question when it comes to technology. Is it actually better or at least as good as a private security officer? So we have to really have that mantra going forward. We have to make sure that we're improving security, not just going to technology for technology's sake, but thankfully technology is advancing where we can take advantage and actually make things better while blending the two together, private security personnel and technology. Next, we're going to look at sort of as a conclusion here, some of the obstacles and reluctance when it comes to adopting technology, when it comes to private security. For many, many years, and quite frankly, this is still happening in discussions about replacement. We don't need to replace security officers with X. We don't need to replace that post with Y. And what can a camera do that a security officer can't, et cetera, et cetera. So when I talk about technology, I don't talk about terms of replacement. Next, you'll see I talk about in terms of embracement. It's not replacing private security officers. You're going to see that trend continue. The need for qualified, trained security officers is always going to be there. We could do an entire session on the challenges of retaining and attracting top quality talent. But look at this in a slightly different way. Security officers and we as companies have to learn to leverage technology to better protect our customers' assets. We also have to look for applications where it works and technology that is reliable. Quite often, we've gone to customers and said, hey, we see an application for this. We see where this will fit in. But let's do a proof of concept. Let's see how it works, making sure that there's backups in place so they're not vulnerable, but making sure that we're using in the right environment and the right application. And like I said before, is it good or better than personnel? If the answer is no, then turn around and go in the other direction. Customers are now demanding it. One of the things in the future we're going to see is more people demanding that. How can you make our security plan better utilizing technology? And ask yourself this question this afternoon if you're still on the fence. What are those obstacles that you're facing when it comes to embracing technology? It may be robotics. It may be artificial intelligence, remote video monitoring, et cetera. But how do we break through those obstacles so we as an industry can move forward with the best countermeasures possible? Well, let's wrap this up. We've talked a lot about where the industry has been, where the industry is now, and where it's going. So, Jeff, look forward to having a great discussion.
Thank you for the master's degree in security and doing that in record time. Really, really appreciate that. So we got tons of questions, some that were forwarded over to me in previous discussions on LinkedIn, and others that are connected, of course, to the webinar, which we're excited about. So a couple things. One, first of the list and is technology. We're going to kind of go backwards. I love making sure that we give people very tactical, pragmatic information. So when they're making decisions to leave this webinar, they've got a go-to, an action item. So one of the questions is, what do I do next, Eddie? I believe you, technology is here. What happens next? And so can you give them some recommendations, some forethought about what that looks like?
Here is the great thing about being in our industry during this time is we can leverage partnerships like we've never done before. Hate to keep talking about 30 years ago, but I always use that as a reference point. When I first got into management and I was going out and I was talking to customers, to be quite frank, it was a very intimidating experience talking about different aspects of security. I knew the nuts and bolts. I knew about security officers. I knew where they should be positioned, and I could sort of cobble together a good security plan. But when people started throwing CCTV and all these different terminologies at me, I began to think, whoa, 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 I don't know anything about that. I can give you an unarmed security officer or an armed security officer. I just need to call my insurance company and make sure that's okay. And nowadays, it's a great time to sort of be alive in our industry because you can leverage so much expertise through partnerships. Many, many years ago, we used to sit around and talk about, I'll just take one example, remote video monitoring. Well, I've got to go build a SOC. That's going to be X amount. I've got to get qualified operators. I've got to get camera analytics, et cetera. And if you want to do that, more power to you. That's great. Go down that road. Or you can partner up with a company that's already done that and that is on the cutting edge of that technology already. And I've had people over the years say, well, yeah, but the customer wants us to do it. That may be correct, but my experience is the customer just wants it done right and it wants it to be done effectively. So my advice would be search out those companies that have the technology expertise, that would be more than willing to partner up with you, because let's be honest, that there's incentives on both ends. We want to get in front of your customers, and as a supplier, we want to make sure that we're leveraging your technology. So one of the great things today is you can go to, whether it's ASIS, GSX, ISC coming up in a few weeks, you can find a multitude of partners that'll walk you through that technology forest, so to speak, right, and show you where to go and what applications are available.
Excellent. Great, great, great. And by the way, you know, not to do a show and tell it all, but when you mentioned your technology background, I don't know if you know this about me. I started with the IBM Selectric typewriter, so I have got a deep-seated technology background, as you're well aware.
I think both you and I have robbed the Smithsonian, I think, today. So there's a lot.
By the way, love the Watergate story, just separate. Public-private relationships. We've seen, obviously, a reduction, early retirements, actually record number of early retirements for the New York City police force. And that's another rabbit hole we can go down. But recommendations for those that say, you know what, I believe in it, I don't know what to do next. Who would I engage? How would I do it? What does a public-private relationship look like? Are you using any? And if so, what would you tell a security owner today if you wanted to start down that road?
Yeah, public-private partnerships have been around literally since the beginning of time. You know, we talked about some of the watchmen versus some of the police back in the Middle Ages, et cetera. But in today's environment, it takes on even a more critical necessity depending on where you are. Let's say in a metropolitan city, we're seeing a lot of programs out there that are intended to leverage what the security officer is doing and seeing day in and day out.
Right.
So whether you're in a small town or a metropolitan environment, the best way is to reach out to that law enforcement agency and really talk about what programs are in place. ASIS, for example, does a great job of this, not just people transitioning from the public to the private, but really solidifying those partnerships, because sort of like technology versus security officers, there used to be this law enforcement versus security. Thankfully, we're seeing much more of a mesh in many locations. We had a situation, I obviously won't talk about the details, but where we were supplying security at a premises right by where a homicide took place. And the perpetrator actually ran onto the property, and the officer observed the person and even saw where he had thrown the murder weapon. Thankfully, we had a relationship with the local PD where we were able to call, come out, take statements, and really have that relationship that was already established. So there's formalized programs that exist in many cities, so take advantage of that. But also really realizing that, as you said, the budgets are constrained. The resources are continue to be finite in the future when it comes to law enforcement. And we can debate, is that a good thing, bad thing? Does it need to change?
Right.
But private security is going to become much more important. So just something as simple as having that communication. If you're at a large site, for example, invite law enforcement out a couple of times a year to tour the property and talk about what they're seeing. So all kind of things you can do to solidify that.
Yeah. I know back, Columbus, we all know what he did, but he was the first government contractor, right? And,
Absolutely.
and we attended an event together. I want to say it was last year, maybe a couple of years back with a NASCO event where they brought some people in from the FBI. And I
Yeah.
thought their outreach specifically around Home Depot and Lowe's with chemicals that could turn into explosives. And they were really looking for people to reach out to them. So maybe I can post that against this platform on LinkedIn to give people some additional air cover on that. Another topic, Eddie, and this one near and dear to my heart, another rabbit hole, we can do a whole segment on it, but you talk a lot about public perception. And it led into, obviously, your background and the history and something that we should feel pride against. How does that come up, if at all, during your presentations? I know you are part of a wonderful company with a lot of legacy experience, 50 plus years. And I see you had Smith in the presentations, and we've got probably a dozen companies that have that kind of legacy. And I would imagine from a chief security officer, that would feel good to me. But does perception come up? Do you use that as a branding opportunity when you're selling your services, that because we have this great brand and legacy, is that important, and can you monetize?
Yes, perception is certainly important in any industry. The security industry certainly battles perception issues. You and I have talked a lot about that. And as I mentioned a couple of times, we've got to do a better job of telling our story for that reason. But perception is reality, as we all know. And that even touches on even the private-public partnership aspect, how we're viewed sometimes by law enforcement. I've seen, again, a great progress being made in that area. It's not complete yet, but it really comes down to security company owners spotlighting what we do day in and day out. I use the Frank Wills example. It's something everybody can relate to. Everybody knows about Watergate. And again, people may have heard that story. They may not have heard it. But what about the simple acts every single day that sort of pass under that bar of public perception of seeing what is happening? The private security officer that may be securing even a daycare or a private school or a shopping mall, what he or she is seeing every day. I had a person in the government that did some pretty interesting work. We were at dinner one night, and I do like every person does. Hey, tell me some juicy stories about, hey, what have you seen? What have you heard? I never forget, he told me, Eddie, we stop more things that you will never know about. And by the way, if you did know about it, you would probably weep openly going to sleep every night if you knew what we were dealing with every day. Right. Now, not to compare that apples to private security, but we really experience the same thing. People don't know what is happening day in and day out. So when it comes to the perception of your company, when it comes to the perception of private security in general, the only real antidote to that perception problem, so to speak, is telling that story effectively. That's why I always bring up security officers aren't just sitting on a stool watching the back gate at a factory. Nothing wrong with that, by the way. But they're securing critical infrastructure. You know this, Jeff. You've been there many times. You walk up and down the streets of Washington, D.C., you're not going to see, in most cases, D.C. Metropolitan Police. You're going to see private security contractors securing some of the most important buildings in our country. So the perception of the industry has a change, but that's where the companies can come in, not just talking about, hey, we're the best, we do things better. That's great. That's part of marketing, but also this is how valuable our services really are.
Yeah, that's great. Eddie, we've watched the consolidation of our industry by historic measure, right? Private equity and allied acquisitions, et cetera. And majority of the people on this webinar today, I'm certain, have 250 or less security officers. It makes up the majority of the remaining companies. A lot of them do not have the ability, the financial ability, to have a dedicated HR person, a dedicated legal staff, dedicated marketing, dedicated trainers, etc. Any recommendations for places they can go, kind of what I would call fractional ownership almost, but what other associations, organizations? I know you speak at a lot of them, some in Chicago, Assist in Texas. Any other organizations that they can kind of latch onto?
I mean, to me, and again, full disclosure, I'm a member of the global board of ASIS, been a member for, a few decades at this point. And I've seen ASIS, by the way, go through an evolution, to borrow from our title here, to really morph into that information sharing association. When I got into management, literally there was nowhere to turn beyond, of course, I had great supervision and great mentors internally. But if I wanted to find out about HR, for example, or how to deal with an issue, I can recall, and I'm going to really tell my age here again, when FMLA first came out, thinking, what is this? What does this mean to us? How do we deal with this? There was nobody to turn to.
Right.
I didn't want to go drop, hundreds of dollars to speak to an attorney who, by the way, probably didn't know any more than I did because it just came out.
Right.
But now, SHRM, for example, on the HR side, ASIS, when it comes to the security, ASIS has something called subject area communities. I mentioned before, I'm not a tech expert. There are many things I'm not an expert in, but guess what? I know a lot of people that are.
Right.
And through ASIS, I can leverage their expertise. For example, one of the things that, and again, we could have gone in a million different directions about challenges. Take cannabis, for example. Mm-hmm. I am not an expert in cannabis. Insert joke here. Maybe I'm an expert in research and development. But if somebody comes to me and says, "Hey, tell us the best practice for securing a cannabis facility in California," I'm going to get in really, really deep, if I start saying, "Oh, secure the perimeter and remote video monitoring and man trap," and I don't know what I'm talking about. I've got a general idea, but guess what? Through associations like ASIS, I can tap into the cannabis security community, a real thing, by the way. They're working on a cannabis standard. So it sort of goes back to what I was saying before, leverage that information. And here's one of the great things about our industry that I've seen, and it may be this way in other industries. I don't know. I've been doing this all my life. Our industry is great about sharing information. I've never called a colleague and he or she has never said, tough, you deal with that on your own. I'm not telling you about the best practices or who we use for incident reporting. Right. Google it. Everybody's always, hey, let me send you Jeff DiDomenico's phone number. He'll walk you through the track tick process, or here's somebody else's phone number that'll walk you through uniform. So our industry is great. Don't be afraid to reach out. Reach out to me. And if I don't know, I'll put you in touch with somebody that does.
Totally agree. I leveraged that early on in my infancy in the industry. Could not believe how willing and open people were. And of course, today with a lot of subcontracting going on, that's already happening. But that's another great example. Eddie, if you had to pick a target, so you could pick anything you want, any industry you want that you think is closest to aggregating the use of this kind of managed services environment. And I don't care what that is, whether it's access control, cameras, drones, robots, pick your poison. Are there any particular industries that lean in a little bit heavily just because of whether geography or their makeup, that would be easier to climb the technology burden? Again, retail, custom retail, stadiums, agra, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, at the risk of saying all of the above, one of the areas that we're personally seeing a lot of that is in the logistics industry. And the reason for that is traditionally that's very concentrated on the access control aspect, obviously product coming in, going out, the officer having to really engage in that, making sure they're getting down information. And the problem has always been, and I'm sure there are many people on this call that are probably going to shake their head and say, I've been there, done that. While that is happening, the back fence is being breached and product is being stolen because the security officer did his hourly round, and that was 20 minutes ago. Right. And again, it's situational based on geographic environment, but I'm seeing a huge uptick in whether it's catalytic converters, lost product, and shall we say, the perpetrators are much more brazen than they once were. So we could talk all day too about even a safety aspect when it comes to a security officer versus technology, but we're seeing leveraging that. And again, it goes back to it'll never replace security officers. You'll never hear me say, oh, in 2080, there'll be no more security officers. First of all, I'll be gone. It won't matter to me at that point, but you're always going to have a need for that. But here's a question I pose to customers. What is better? A camera that's constantly scanning a large area with video analytics, and that's going to progress, even get better 24/7 to be alert for intrusions, or the security officer in the truck that sort of creeps by once an hour? I'm not a tech expert, but I know the first is certainly superior. So we're seeing that in logistics. We're seeing that even creep into hospitality and certainly Class A environments. I always give this example when I talk about technology in a very general sense. I travel quite a bit, and I always tell people I don't have to talk to anybody unless I want to. I've got an e-boarding pass, I've got a digital key, I hop in the rent-a-car, et cetera. So all industries are adopting that, but it goes back to where is it going to work the best way and the most effective way.
Excellent. As we wrap up here, I'm going to give you one more question, but remind the audience that they will have plenty of opportunity to re-see this. We'll be posting this all over LinkedIn. You're very available, I know that, and speaking on this subjects. If a person wants to hang up today and focus on one or two legal issues that potentially will gain more traction as the year goes on, what do you think those are, and how should they be prepared to recognize what they need to do about it?
Yeah, a couple of things that I would sort of close with on the legal issues. First of all, if you're a multi-state operation, you've got a very, very difficult challenge in the coming years with states that are taking on initiatives that the federal government hasn't, whether it's minimum wage, recreational drug use, et cetera. So if you're in a multi-state organization and you don't have a good in-house, and by the way, even if you do have a good in-house, you want to start to have partnerships that have that subject matter expertise. So I think we're going to really see that more and more. I mentioned First Amendment auditors. Now, it's certainly debatable how serious of a legal issue this really is, because it really comes down to private property rights. And if you don't know about First Amendment auditors, just go on YouTube and type in First Amendment auditors, security officers, and you'll get thousands of videos, examples, how to do it right, how to do it wrong. But really making sure that your officer knows what he or she really should and should not do. Again, going back 32 years ago, I had no fear that I was being taped 24/7.
Right.
If I made someone angry because they didn't have their employee badge, there was no fear that I was going to wind up on social media by 5 o'clock, because I didn't handle it the right way. So I think one thing is going to be, how do you respond effectively in situations where maybe verbal techniques are required versus use of force? So what I'm seeing more and more that's concerning is, how do you make sure you have the training in place and each officer knows how to deal effectively when situations call for force, what level of force needs to be used, because now we're going to be faced with probably having a crystal clear video of what's going to happen. So it really is a training issue and knowing what you should do in each situation.
Right on, right on. Eddie, thank you so very much. This will not be the last time we hear of you, and I know that for certain. I thank you for your commitment to our industry, to our company specifically, and to really wanting to be generous with your information, your experiences. We thank you so much. And to the Track Tip Valiant Team, Track Force folks, just thank you so much for putting it all together, making it seamless and making it effective. So thank you all very much. Have a great afternoon, and tune in again for our next episode. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jeff.
Take care, Eddie.